Have you ever wondered why governments around the world require so much documentation? From birth certificates to tax forms, paperwork seems to be everywhere. In this video, we'll explore the reasons behind these requirements and how documentation plays a crucial role in society. We'll start by understanding what government documentation actually is, and then move on to see why it's so important for both individuals and the state. Let's dive in and uncover the logic behind all those forms and certificates. Government documentation refers to official papers or digital records issued or required by authorities. These include identity cards, licenses, permits, and certificates. Such documents serve as proof of identity, status, or compliance with regulations. Without them, it would be difficult for governments to manage populations, provide services, or enforce laws. In the next scene, we'll look at how these documents help establish identity and why that's so important. One of the primary reasons for government documentation is to establish and verify identity. Birth certificates, passports, and national ID cards are all examples of documents that confirm who you are. These papers are essential for accessing services like education, healthcare, and voting. They also help prevent fraud and ensure that rights and responsibilities are assigned correctly. Next, we'll see how documentation supports public administration. Documentation is the backbone of public administration. It allows governments to keep accurate records of citizens, property, and transactions. This information is vital for planning infrastructure, allocating resources, and delivering public services efficiently. Without proper documentation, it would be nearly impossible to manage a modern society. In the following scene, we'll discuss how documentation helps maintain law and order. Law enforcement agencies rely heavily on documentation. Police reports, court records, and licenses all help authorities track activities and enforce laws. Proper documentation ensures that justice is served and that individuals are held accountable for their actions. It also protects citizens' rights by providing a clear record of events and decisions. Next, we'll see how documentation is crucial for economic activities. Economic transactions often require documentation, such as business licenses, tax forms, and contracts. These documents provide legal certainty and protect the interests of all parties involved. They also help governments collect taxes and regulate commerce. Without proper documentation, businesses would struggle to operate, and economic growth would be hindered. In the next scene, we'll look at how documentation supports social welfare programs. Social welfare programs, such as unemployment benefits or healthcare subsidies, depend on documentation to verify eligibility and track distribution. Governments use records to ensure that assistance reaches those who need it most and to prevent abuse of the system. Accurate documentation also helps in evaluating the effectiveness of these programs. Next, we'll explore how documentation aids in disaster response and recovery. In times of disaster, documentation becomes even more critical. Governments use records to identify affected individuals, distribute aid, and coordinate relief efforts. Documentation ensures that resources are allocated fairly and that recovery processes are transparent. It also helps in rebuilding communities by providing proof of property ownership and personal identity. In the next scene, we'll discuss the role of documentation in education. Educational institutions require documentation, such as transcripts, diplomas, and enrollment records. These documents validate a person's academic achievements and qualifications. They are essential for continuing education, applying for jobs, or moving to another country. Proper documentation also helps governments monitor educational standards and plan for future needs. Next, we'll see how documentation supports international travel. Passports, visas, and travel permits are all forms of government documentation required for international travel. These documents ensure that travelers are identified and that their movements are tracked for security and immigration purposes. Without them, international borders would be chaotic and unsafe. In the next scene, we'll look at how documentation helps protect public health. Health records, vaccination certificates, and medical licenses are all crucial forms of documentation in the healthcare system. These documents help track disease outbreaks, verify qualifications of medical professionals, and ensure that public health policies are followed. Accurate documentation is essential for effective healthcare delivery and for responding to health emergencies. Next, we'll discuss how documentation supports national security. National security agencies depend on documentation to monitor borders, issue security clearances, and track potential threats. Proper records help prevent illegal activities and ensure that only authorized individuals have access to sensitive areas. Documentation also supports intelligence gathering and crisis management. In the next scene, we'll see how documentation preserves cultural heritage. Governments maintain records of historical events, artifacts, and traditions through documentation. These records help preserve cultural heritage for future generations and support research and education. Documentation ensures that important aspects of a nation's identity are not lost over time. Next, we'll discuss the role of documentation in environmental protection. Environmental regulations require documentation such as permits, inspection reports, and compliance certificates. These documents help governments monitor pollution, enforce laws, and protect natural resources. Accurate records are essential for holding polluters accountable and ensuring sustainable development. In the next scene, we'll see how documentation supports scientific research. Scientific research often relies on government documentation, such as patents, research permits, and data archives. These records ensure that discoveries are properly credited and that research is conducted ethically and safely. Documentation also helps share knowledge and advance innovation. Next, we'll discuss how documentation enables transparency and accountability. Government documentation is key to transparency and accountability. Public records, such as budgets and meeting minutes, allow citizens to see how decisions are made and how resources are used. This openness helps build trust and prevents corruption. In the next scene, we'll look at how documentation supports legal rights and protections. Legal documents, such as contracts, court orders, and property deeds, protect individuals' rights and interests. These records provide evidence in disputes and help ensure that laws are applied fairly. Proper documentation is essential for upholding justice and safeguarding freedoms. Next, we'll see how documentation helps in population management. Census records, birth and death certificates, and immigration papers are all vital for managing population data. Governments use this information to plan services, allocate funding, and track demographic changes. Accurate documentation ensures that everyone is counted and that resources are distributed fairly. In the next scene, we'll discuss the importance of documentation in elections. Voter registration forms, ballots, and election results are all forms of documentation that ensure the integrity of elections. These records help prevent fraud, guarantee that every vote is counted, and provide transparency in the electoral process. Proper documentation is essential for democracy to function effectively. Next, we'll look at how documentation supports international relations. Governments use documentation such as treaties, diplomatic notes, and trade agreements to manage relationships with other countries. These records provide a legal basis for cooperation and help resolve disputes. Documentation is essential for maintaining peace and promoting global collaboration. In the next scene, we'll discuss the role of documentation in taxation. Tax forms, receipts, and financial statements are all necessary for governments to collect revenue and fund public services. Documentation ensures that taxes are calculated correctly and that everyone pays their fair share. It also helps prevent tax evasion and supports economic stability. Next, we'll see how documentation is used in property management. Property deeds, land titles, and building permits are all forms of documentation that establish ownership and regulate development. These records protect property rights and help resolve disputes. Proper documentation is essential for orderly urban planning and investment. In the next scene, we'll discuss the importance of documentation in transportation. Driver's licenses, vehicle registrations, and transport permits are all necessary documentation for safe and efficient transportation. These records help authorities enforce traffic laws, ensure vehicle safety, and plan infrastructure. Documentation also supports insurance and accident investigations. Next, we'll look at how documentation is used in business regulation. Business licenses, permits, and compliance certificates are all forms of documentation that regulate commercial activities. These records ensure that businesses operate legally and meet safety and quality standards. Proper documentation also protects consumers and supports fair competition. In the next scene, we'll discuss the role of documentation in immigration. Passports, visas, and residency permits are all essential for managing immigration. These documents help governments track who enters and leaves the country, enforce immigration laws, and protect national security. Proper documentation also supports the integration of newcomers into society. Next, we'll see how documentation is used in public safety. Safety certificates, inspection reports, and emergency plans are all forms of documentation that help protect the public. These records ensure that buildings, products, and services meet safety standards. Documentation also supports emergency response and disaster preparedness. In the next scene, we'll discuss the importance of documentation in the justice system. Court records, legal filings, and police reports are all essential documentation in the justice system. These records provide evidence, support investigations, and ensure that legal processes are transparent and fair. Proper documentation is crucial for upholding the rule of law. Next, we'll see how documentation supports public participation. Petitions, public comments, and meeting minutes are all forms of documentation that enable citizens to participate in government. These records ensure that voices are heard and that decisions are made transparently. Documentation also helps track public opinion and policy outcomes. In the next scene, we'll discuss the importance of documentation in technology and innovation. Patents, copyrights, and technology licenses are all forms of documentation that protect intellectual property and encourage innovation. These records ensure that inventors and creators are rewarded for their work. Proper documentation also supports research and development. Next, we'll see how documentation is used in communication and media. Broadcast licenses, press credentials, and publication records are all forms of documentation that regulate communication and media. These documents ensure that information is shared responsibly and that media outlets operate legally. Documentation also supports freedom of expression and access to information. In the next scene, we'll discuss the importance of documentation in social services. Social service agencies rely on documentation such as case files, service records, and eligibility forms to provide support to individuals and families. These records ensure that assistance is delivered effectively and that clients' needs are met. Proper documentation also helps evaluate program outcomes and improve services. Next, we'll see how documentation is used in public health campaigns. Documentation such as vaccination records, health surveys, and campaign reports are essential for planning and evaluating public health initiatives. These records help track progress, identify gaps, and ensure that resources are used effectively. Proper documentation is key to improving population health. In the next scene, we'll discuss the role of documentation in emergency management. Emergency plans, incident reports, and resource inventories are all forms of documentation that help governments prepare for and respond to crises. These records ensure that responses are coordinated and that lessons are learned for future emergencies. Documentation also supports recovery and rebuilding efforts. Next, we'll see how documentation is used in infrastructure development. Building permits, project plans, and inspection reports are all necessary documentation for infrastructure projects. These records ensure that construction meets safety and quality standards and that projects are completed on time and within budget. Proper documentation also supports maintenance and future upgrades. In the next scene, we'll discuss the importance of documentation in environmental monitoring. Environmental monitoring relies on documentation, such as inspection logs, pollution reports, and compliance certificates. These records help track environmental changes and ensure that regulations are followed. Proper documentation is essential for protecting natural resources and public health. Next, we'll see how documentation is used in resource management. Resource management involves documentation, such as allocation records, usage reports, and inventory lists. These documents help governments distribute resources efficiently and prevent waste. Proper documentation also supports planning and sustainability. In the next scene, we'll discuss the role of documentation in cultural events. Permits, event plans, and attendance records are all forms of documentation required for organizing cultural events. These records ensure that events are safe, well-organized, and accessible to the public. Documentation also helps evaluate the success of events and plan for future activities. Next, we'll see how documentation is used in public utilities. Utility bills, service contracts, and maintenance records are all necessary documentation for managing public utilities. These records ensure that services are delivered reliably and that infrastructure is maintained. Proper documentation also supports billing and customer service. In the next scene, we'll discuss the importance of documentation in consumer protection. Consumer protection relies on documentation such as warranties, receipts, and complaint records. These documents help resolve disputes, ensure product safety, and protect consumer rights. Proper documentation also supports regulatory enforcement. Next, we'll see how documentation is used in employment and labor relations. Employment contracts, payroll records, and labor permits are all forms of documentation that regulate work relationships. These records ensure that workers' rights are protected and that employers comply with labor laws. Proper documentation also supports fair wages and safe working conditions. In the next scene, we'll discuss the importance of documentation in pensions and retirement. Pension records, retirement plans, and benefit statements are all necessary documentation for managing retirement benefits. These records ensure that individuals receive the support they are entitled to and that funds are managed responsibly. Proper documentation also helps prevent fraud and errors. Next, we'll see how documentation is used in family law. Marriage certificates, divorce decrees, and child custody orders are all forms of documentation used in family law. These records protect the rights of family members and provide legal clarity in personal matters. Proper documentation is essential for resolving disputes and ensuring justice. In the next scene, we'll discuss the importance of documentation in inheritance and succession. Wills, probate records, and inheritance certificates are all necessary documentation for managing the transfer of assets after death. These records ensure that property is distributed according to the law and the wishes of the deceased. Proper documentation also helps prevent disputes among heirs. Next, we'll see how documentation is used in citizenship and nationality. Citizenship certificates, naturalization papers, and passports are all forms of documentation that establish a person's legal status in a country. These records are essential for accessing rights and privileges, such as voting and social services. Proper documentation also supports national identity and integration. In the final scene, we'll summarize why government documentation matters. In summary, government documentation is essential for the smooth functioning of society. It supports everything from identity, verification, and public administration to economic activity and social welfare. Proper documentation ensures transparency, accountability, and fairness in countless aspects of daily life. By understanding why governments require documentation, we can better appreciate the systems that keep our communities organized and secure. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the world of government paperwork.